This is TechKnow, a show about innovations that can change lives.
The science of fighting a wildfire.
We're going to explore the intersection of hardware and humanity, but we're doing it in a unique way. This is a show about science
Oh my God.
by scientists.
TechKnow investigates Katrina after the storm.
During Katrina, a large amount of water rushed in from the Gulf.
The walls were engineered to stop Mother Nature. They failed.
Do you think that New Orleans is safer than 10 years ago?
Now rebuilt, higher, stronger, billions of dollars spent. New tech to predict storms.
We'll be able to make measurements of the winds as they change very quickly.
But is this city safe?
Do I feel 100% safe? No.
Marita Davison is an environmental biologist.
As the waves are coming in, explain to me what's happening.
Tonight, she goes inside the lab to bring the latest research that could stop the next superstorm. And I'm Phil Torres. I'm an entomologist.
So how did Katrina change the residents' attitude towards nature?
Now, TechKnow in New Orleans.
I'm here in Jefferson Parish in the exact spot that was submerged back in August 2005. Now, I'm 6'2", and if I stretch my hand up to this height, triple that. That's how high some of the floodwaters were in some neighborhoods here in this area. Now, while the waters are long gone, the issues are not. TechKnow's Marita Davison has spent a week here in New Orleans. Now, Marita, you've been piecing together what went wrong from a science and engineering perspective.
And Phil, you said it. This community was devastated when Hurricane Katrina hit. Scientists have made significant improvements to the system. These are coming together to form multiple lines of defense that reduce the risks from another Katrina-like storm. Let's take a look.
This area has been vulnerable to storms like Katrina since 1,200 years ago.
Katrina was really a wake-up call to the Corps of Engineers.
What Katrina did, it sort of helped it because it brought the eye to what's happening when you destroy things. If we don't repair the things that protects us, in 80 years, the city of New Orleans would be underwater.
Hurricane Katrina is still considered one of this country's most deadly storms. In August 2005, Katrina claimed more than 1,800 lives along the Gulf Coast, leaving 80% of New Orleans underwater. When Katrina hit New Orleans, she was only a Category 3 storm. But in many places, the city had only one line of defense: levees, made of earth. In 50 different locations, those levees failed. In the 9th Ward, major levee breaches and overtopping caused entire homes to be swept away, killing hundreds, while others scrambled to rooftops for safety. In St. Bernard Parish, more than 5,000 children were reported missing during the height of the storm. And the neighborhood of Lakeview, located right next to a major storm defense system, was basically washed away. 1 month later, the head of the Army Corps of Engineers, Colonel Carl Strock, was forced to testify before Congress for his agency's role in the disaster. Since the 1920s, that branch of the military has been responsible for the city's structural defenses. 1 year later, they released a 6,000-page report publicly accepting responsibility for the levee failures. Colonel Carl Strock said, quote, "We had a catastrophic failure, and words alone will not restore trust in the Corps." Do you think that New Orleans is safer?
New Orleans has much more robust flood defenses than it did 10 years ago, unquestionably.
Mike Park is the Chief of Operations for the Army Corps of Engineers New Orleans District. He was born here and in charge of cleanup and rebuilding after the storm.
Construction is in progress.
The Army Corps has been working non-stop to mitigate storm damage. Their solution, still 1 year away from completion, is the new Storm Risk Reduction System. This new system surrounds 4 New Orleans parishes. It now includes 133 miles of levees, flood walls, surge barriers, and pumping stations. This innovation, the Rappel system, is also one of the new solutions being tested by the Corps. It's essentially a giant plug. When there's a breach, it can be inflated on shore. Then engineers float it towards the breach, hoping the pull of the water will wedge the plug tightly enough to slow the leak. During Katrina, the 17th Street Canal was the site of one of the worst levee breaches. Today, it's one of the last pieces in the $14.5 billion defense system. Now, have the design criteria been more strict, more stringent this time around?
Yes, the system design has really evolved based a lot on the lessons that were learned from Hurricane Katrina.
For example, an eye wall design was previously used on floodwalls, which was a simple straight steel beam driven into the ground. Now, T-walls made of concrete and steel provide more support around the base of the walls. The entire system is all designed to reduce the risk associated with a 100-year storm, like Katrina, down to 1% each year. How should the New Orleans public interpret that? Should they feel safer?
The system that's in place now is the most robust system for flood risk reduction that we've ever enjoyed. But they should not be complacent. There's always a residual risk of flooding from storms that exceed that design.
The flooding at 17th Street Canal in 2005 is a good example of the tremendous engineering challenges the Corps faces. What exactly went wrong here?
The storm surge 10 years ago was able to penetrate up into this 17th Street drainage canal, and the eye wall failed, releasing a flood that came into the community.
After Katrina, the Army Corps of Engineers began to build additional lines of defense at the 17th Street Canal, a flood wall, more pumping stations, and higher levees. Southern Louisiana is hot and swampy, so constant soil erosion and sediment displacement, as well as the fact, in some places, New Orleans is up to 800 feet below sea level, is why this city is so naturally prone to flooding.
Yes, and I take off to the south with a north departure.
At 1,000 feet, flying just on the outskirts of New Orleans, it becomes very obvious how a large surge of water would have caused the devastation that we saw during Hurricane Katrina.
Most of South Louisiana is new land. There's no stones down here. It's all sediment.
Foster Crupel's family has lived on this delta for generations. About 50 miles outside New Orleans in Port Sulphur, they've seen their share of flooding, especially during Katrina.
The delta is 85% organic. It's plant growth and decay.
Try to build a sound structure on that, but Foster Crupel did anyway. He bought the old Woodlands plantation from auction and turned it into a bed and breakfast. Woodlands is also outside the Army Corps' new storm risk reduction system, and Foster is actually glad. His common sense approach to flooding may seem radical to some, but Foster Crupel is part of a movement looking to nature for protection.
I think we should lower the levees, front and back, raise our houses, and reintroduce the river to the delta.
By lowering the levees, as you suggest, you'd have to deal with flooding more regularly. Are you willing to deal with that?
I am. I'd rather deal with the annual flood from the Mississippi River than the big floods that come from the storms.
Foster says trying to overmanage the river has caused waterways to become too salty, killing huge chunks of the delta that used to naturally buffer people from storms.
First, we clear-cut the cypress swamps. Then we built the levees. Then we harvested most of the old natural oyster reefs. And then we started drilling and dredging and drilling and dredging for oil and gas. I definitely need air conditioning. I like to travel. I love oysters, but at the same time, I also would like to be protected from storm surges.
New Orleans, the Crescent City, is a cultural and historical gem worth preserving. So when the MrGo channel was built in the late 1950s, many people were already saying, MrGo must go. MrGo is what locals call the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, once dubbed the Surge Superhighway, It's a 76-mile artificial channel built for commercial shipping. Dr. John Lopez is a member of the MrGo Must Go coalition. He's also a coastal biologist who consulted for the Army Corps of Engineers. Tell me about the MrGo. Why was it created?
Like a lot of federal projects, it was based on some sort of cost benefit that they projected by increased commercial use navigation on the channel. Now, that might seem kind of ironic because it's built right adjacent to the Mississippi River. So they saw some advantage, but in reality is it didn't pan out. That the use of the channel was very small.
And because MrGo cut right through precious wetlands that act as a flood buffer, there were immediate community concerns.
There were people even before that, St. Bernard, some locals who really just very heroically trying to fight to get this thing changed, but it was just a few locals fighting this huge federal bureaucracy.
Their concerns proved valid on August 29th, 2005. We're at the part of the MrGo channel that's called the funnel. During Katrina, a large amount of water rushed in from the Gulf, concentrated right here, and pushed into the city of New Orleans and the surrounding communities. For several miles, earthen levees along the MrGo's banks were completely leveled by storm surge. In some places, waves were well over 10 feet high. In 2009, 8 different scientists linked MrGo to most of the deepest and most violent flooding in both St. Bernard Parish and the lower 9th Ward. Together, both parishes also suffered the largest losses of life during Katrina. Now, is it possible to say that had the MrGo not been there, the impacts of Katrina would have been less?
Yeah, I think, yes, very clearly. But presumably they would have built a levee, and that levee probably would have been better because you would have had probably miles of wetlands in front of it. There would have been less damage. There would have been fewer people that were killed.
3 years after Katrina, and multiple lawsuits later, Congress finally agreed. MrGo was deauthorized. The Army Corps of Engineers officially closed the channel for good. At least 3 impact studies, including one from the Corps itself, urged the federal government to begin restoring the wetlands. Where does nature and natural defenses fit into the design here?
Certainly, the coastal environments can provide a buffer against storm surge. And it's very critical for the long-term sustainability of this constructed system.
About 4 hours north in Vicksburg, Mississippi, the Army Corps of Engineers scientists are studying the exact impact coastal vegetation has on storm surge. Jane McKee Smith is a civil engineer. She's been studying the Louisiana coastline since Katrina.
And so there's a lot of effort ongoing now to restore wetlands, and because that will help dissipate not only the waves, but it'll also attenuate the surge. But if we're going to include that into our designs, we have to know how much.
As the waves are coming in, explain to me what's happening.
What we're seeing in this case is the waves coming in, we see it traveling through, and as it comes through, the vegetation is mobile. So what we want to do is not only show how the waves change as they go through, but we want to have the dissipation as a function of distance, the height of the vegetation, the width of the vegetation, and also the density of the vegetation.
Since Katrina, the High Security Coastal and Hydraulics Lab has faced an added sense of urgency, says Ty Walmsley, the chief of flood storm protection.
So we really advanced our numerical modeling after Katrina. Another big part of what we began to understand after Katrina was the importance and how the natural system interacts with the engineered system, so that we can design the engineered system to not fight nature, but kind of work alongside and work with it.
This area I'm standing in is meant to simulate a coastal shoreline. It can even be filled with sand or other sediments so the Army Corps of Engineers can study how waves impact erosion. And erosion, both before and after Katrina, has left the city of New Orleans vulnerable.
We're being pragmatic about this, and frankly, we'd like to see more restoration on the outside of the levee, because when it's on the outside, it helps provide that surge buffer.
But very little has been done to restore wetlands along MrGo. According to the state of Louisiana's 2012 Master Plan for a Sustainable Coast report that the Army Corps supports, an additional $50 billion is needed to protect New Orleans. There wasn't a whole lot of funding for wetland restoration then?
There was a small increment of funding that was provided to complement the system, about $20 million.
But everyone agrees it's not nearly enough. The Army Corps has tried to enter a cost-sharing program with the state, but so far no agreement has been reached. Ironically, coastal Louisiana's biggest wetland restoration funding to date is coming from an unlikely source: British Petroleum.
So I think we're at an interesting threshold here with the BP settlement.
A settlement stemming from the 2011 BP oil spill is expected to infuse Louisiana with $10 billion. A large portion of the money is slated for coastal restoration projects.
I'm reasonably optimistic there'll be a reasonable slice of that for MrGo type projects. Our big takeaway in this Katrina anniversary is that a lot of things have been done and New Orleans is on a good track toward sustainability, but the job is not done here.
If this track is correct, it comes into a point near the Alabama-Mississippi line.
In August 2005, with round-the-clock weather reports, southern Louisiana residents had plenty of warning Katrina was coming. They just didn't know what they were getting.
Then it rolls up our way.
Traditionally, the National Weather Service has relied on hurricane hunters. They fly their planes into the storm to take measurements, and that's how they track them. But for safety reasons, they can only fly when the storm isn't too strong. And even our current satellite technology doesn't allow us to take measurements through heavy rain.
What we were doing with Katrina, the National Weather Service hurricane hunters, they were flying over Katrina with their airplanes when they could, and the last measurements were just a little bit after this, right in this region right here.
Dr. Ruff, a professor of atmospheric science at the University of Michigan, says after that, winds picked up even more, building stronger storm surge. And in those final hours, that couldn't be measured.
So the magnitude of the flooding and also the locations where the flooding happened were very unexpected.
Inspired by Katrina, Dr. Ruff and his team at U of M created a new system of satellites that can measure storm surge. They call it Cygnus.
It's a constellation of 8 small satellites orbiting over the tropics. We'll be able to measure very often because the satellites sort of chase each other around. We'll be able to make measurements of the winds as they change very quickly, which is also something that's never been able to be done before with hurricanes.
Because Cygnus is really a modified GPS receiver that uses satellites already in space, it's not as expensive. Some more can be sent. The more satellites, the more measurements, and therefore the more accurate the storm surge prediction will become.
But I think there's also an important psychological aspect with improved reliability in forecasts, and that is when forecasts are wrong, people tend not to trust the next forecast as much. If they know that forecasts are reliable, they're much more likely to listen when there's a forecast for an emergency.
From future storm surge forecasting by satellites in space, to upgraded flood engineering on the ground, to restoring wetlands to act as a natural buffer, many strategies have been put into place over the past 10 years. But what do residents think of the new storm risk reduction system? I went to the New Orleans 9th Ward to find out. At the time of Katrina, its population was approximately 15,000. 96% were African American. There are no exact numbers on how many 9th Ward residents died during Katrina, but the death toll was the highest there. Today, about 5,600 people live in the 9th Ward. I met with 2 residents there to find out whether they feel safer than they did 10 years ago.
Hey Phil, how you doing? Good. Do I feel 100% safe? No. But I feel much safer now than I did 10 years ago.
Arthur Johnson runs the Sustain the 9 Coalition, right in the heart of one of the hardest hit blocks.
I feel there's also a greater awareness of what safety means.
And that piece, educating residents on how to stay safe from storms, is why Sustain the 9 Coalition was formed right after Katrina.
So how did Katrina change the residents here's attitude?
I've seen changes on how people look at things, what they find important or not important. I've seen them become more advocates for the environment, for what's going on around them.
And then there's John Taylor. You may seem an unlikely environmentalist, but I was introduced to him for a reason.
He's our wetland specialist, but he's the guru on the bayou and the lower nine. And John Taylor.
Mr. Taylor.
How you doing?
Very nice to meet you.
Sam here, Sam.
I've heard you are Mr. Bayou. You know about the wetlands around here.
Well, that one at least.
John Taylor was born and raised in the lower 9th Ward.
Where'd you learn about the wetlands?
At the wetlands. They come find me after Katrina. Everybody said, well, who knows about this wetland? And my name popped up every time they asked.
Taylor's house was destroyed during Katrina, but the lower 9th and the neighboring bayou is home, and he's never considered leaving.
Has the bayou changed since Katrina, or is wilderness still wilderness?
Well, the bayou where I go at was destroyed mostly in '65. Katrina didn't destroy it. But what Katrina did, it sort of helped it because it brought the eye to what's happening when you destroy things.
Taylor points to the Go Swamp, a former cypress grove first destroyed by the lumber industry and then by altering the flow of the Mississippi River, which leached fresh water, killing most of its vegetation.
This is what happened to all the trees.
Since Katrina, a group of nonprofits have become involved in restoring the Go Swamp, a step Mr. Bayou says is in the right direction.
So you obviously love the bayou. What would you like to see it become?
Before I die, I'd like to see them restoring it back to its normal stage. It's protection for everybody. But everybody do not know that. They didn't know that until everybody started taking these surveys and stuff.
But it is from the last 10 years of studying what went wrong during Katrina that a multi-pronged plan has been put in place. It's been a long, costly process that can't completely protect southern Louisiana from every storm, but will hopefully dramatically reduce the damage from them.
After seeing all this, there's one thing that's so clear to me, which is that New Orleans was at risk, is at risk, and probably always will be at risk. And, you know, obviously lives are the priority, but when you stand here in a historic district, you also realize that there is a lot of history at stake as well.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't get more iconic than Jackson Square, and there's no question New Orleans is an American gem. And virtually everyone we spoke to said that today it's safer than it was back then. But probably the biggest takeaway here is that people shouldn't fall into complacency because a storm is going to hit New Orleans again. There's no such thing as protection. We can just reduce the risk.
Now, Marita, is it enough to be prepared for the next Katrina, or do we need to look beyond this?
No, we totally need to look beyond this because, again, storms are going to come here, and a storm is not a storm is not a storm. They're very different kinds of storms. That speaks to the importance of modeling, getting a sense of the whole scope of possibilities that we need to prepare for.
Now, Marita, you've not only spent time here on the ground, but you also got to take a flight and see the vastness and the complexity of this region. What was your takeaway?
Well, I have to tell you, Phil, that was probably the most powerful part of this story for me because when you take that bird's eye view, you not only get to see how this area is so influenced by water and surrounded by water, but also how New Orleans is uniquely vulnerable to a storm like Katrina.
Now, one thing is for certain is that there will be another storm, and it'll be testing the strength and the resilience of the city once again. Thanks for all your hard work here, Marita. Be sure to check us out on the next edition of TechKnow. We'll see you then.
Dive deep into these stories and go behind the scenes at aljazeera.com/techknow. Follow our expert contributors on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Google+, and more.